I'm now going to just introduce Joanna. I met her a long time ago when she emailed in to say that she'd found this amazing story. And I did a bit of research with her, and it got even more and more interesting as time went on. So I know you're going to find it very interesting. And in case some of you drop out before the questions, the area in Mill Road Cemetery has just been cleared, so you could go and see where George Brewster is buried. And if anybody needs to be shown, I am in the cemetery a lot at the moment, so you can always email Mill Road Cemetery site and see if I'll be around to show you. Okay, Joanna, over to you.
Thanks, Mary. I'm Joanna Hudson, and I'm very sorry you can't see my face today, but unfortunately my camera on my laptop's not working. But I assure you that you will see me on the One Show one day telling the world about George Brewster. And you've got the story first. So I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a massive fan of the Mill Road Historical Society, and you'll see why in my presentation. So, my name is Joanna Hudson, and when I was thinking about this talk, I thought I would tell you the story of George Brewster. Or do I tell you the story of how I came across George? And with the help of people along the way, not to mention a few names that are on your screen right now, and I found out about this story, and I went and sometimes in a surprising way, it presented itself to me. So I first did this talk back in 2019 at the Mill Road Winter Fair. You'll remember, Mary and Caro. I came back to it recently to update it for my more recent talks, and it struck me how much of the story has moved on since then. And those were the days before lockdowns and COVID that we all remember. So the beginning of the story remains the same, that my discovery of George's story began when I found a snippet of information igniting my interest. So many of the parts of this story have come to me totally accidentally, and it's almost as if I am being helped along the way. So this story is about my journey discovering George. About a year ago, I was a year ago when I originally wrote this talk, so we're talking 2019 here, I was taking part in a village quiz in a small village where I live called Pampisford, which is near Sawston in South Cambridgeshire. One of the questions in the quiz was something along the lines of, what law was changed by a boy dying in a Fulbourn Lunatic Asylum in 1875 that changed the lives of thousands of children across the country? And of course, no one knew the answer at the quiz, but that moment, my interest was piqued. And not only do I live very near the village of Fulbourn, I actually, at that time, worked in the then lunatic asylum in Fulbourn, which has now been converted into offices. And of course, I wanted to know the answer. Here is an archive photograph of the county and city of Cambridge and the Isle of Ely Lunatic Asylum. Built in 1858, the county asylum at Fulbourn came about as a result of the Lunacy Act of 1845, which had obliged county and borough authorities, without appropriate provision, to develop institutions for the care of their pauper lunatics. It took 13 years to build, and in November 1858 took its first patients. Fast forward 17 years, Chimney Sweep William Wire was paid to sweep the 3 main boiler chimneys at the Fulbourn Lunatic Asylum. Now, if we look at this picture, I've zoomed in on a part of it in the top right where you can see a very tall chimney. And I believe that is the boiler chimney that we are talking about here. So in the census, and I'm sorry about the quality of this, but I hope you can see it. In the census of 1871, just a few years earlier, we find William Wyer, there he is at the top, William Wyer, a sweep, living with his wife and son and daughter. Also living with him is a name called John German. He's 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth down from the top there. Now look at his age. And also it says relation to the family, lodger. Age 11. Occupation, sweep. This is George's predecessor. I did try to find out what happened to this John German, but sadly I've not been able to find any mention of him since the census of 1871. William lived at number 3 Trinity Place, and this is just off King Street in the centre of Cambridge. Back then was a very crowded and poor area of Cambridge. And here is a photo that I found on the Capturing Cambridgeshire website run by the Museum of Cambridge. It says at the bottom, Trinity Place, now disappeared from King Street. The photo isn't dated, sadly, but could this be William's bike here on the left, or even William's cat? And here we find, this is the census of 1871, and we find George's older brother, William Brewster, living at 3 Comet Yard. It's the top family there. Living with his son, with his wife, and their inverted commas son. And it says, well, it says 3 there, if you see, 3 years old, which I think it should be an 8, but you know, we don't know why they might have written 3. But this is not their son, but yet this is William's younger brother, George. Comet Yard no longer exists. It's near Shire Hall, just to the left of Shire Hall. But Comet Yard sadly no longer exists. But if you look lower in the census page on there, you can see it mentions a pub on Castle Street, which would have been only a few buildings away. You can also see from William Brewster there that he was a sawyer, which is a woodcutter, very low paid labouring profession that he had learned from his father, and a profession held by his older brother Barnard also. 4 years after this census was taken, William Wyer and his son had taken on George as an apprentice chimney sweep, and on a cold Thursday in February 1875, they arrived at the Lunatic Asylum in Fulbourn to clean the 3 main boiler chimneys. And like I say, George was an apprentice sweep, but not the apprenticeship opportunity that you would expect today. The more well-known name, for obvious reasons, was a climbing boy, a name given to young boys who were apprenticed chimney sweeps. But this was not the case. They were no more than slaves, often working for no money and very little food. The Industrial Revolution was built on the backs of child-free slave labour. Children made up more than 25% of the British workforce at this time. Up chimneys, down mines, in factories and workshops. A whole workforce always available, easy to control, cheap and easily replaced. Child labour was one of the most significant social ills of Britain's rapid industrialisation in the 18th and 19th century. In 1821, approximately 49% of the workforce was under the age of 20, with 50% of children beginning full-time employment by the age of 9. Chimney sweeps were more often than not children due to their size and their agility. Sweepers argued that clients would often distrust the more modern equipment in favour of children because they could get in all the nooks and crannies. Efforts to end the practice of child labour began in the 18th century, and Jonas Hanway, a wealthy merchant and former apprentice himself, advocated for better working conditions. A parliamentary committee investigated the practice in 1818. Evidence was given by chimney sweep apprentices that spoke of coercion and abuse in all forms of beatings and trickery. These efforts rarely restricted the practice, and without proper form of enforcement, the practice continued with few changes into the late 19th century. I imagine this is the example of the type of chimney that William Wyer would have been paid to clean. And you can see that some of the chimneys have literally 90-degree turns in the flue. Boys would have been using their knees and elbows to propel themselves up the cold, dark chimneys, often causing them to bleed and cause sores that would never heal. Some apprentices told their masters of rubbing acid on these sores to harden the skin. So this is a photo from Google Earth of the Fulbourn Lunatic Asylum as it was today. Much of the frontage of the original building is still standing. And thankfully for me, the boiler part of the structure is no longer standing. So back to George, and you know his story. He sadly became stuck in one of the boiler chimneys, and after having to knock the wall down to get him out, he sadly died. An 11-year-old boy whose life was extinguished far too early. But we've all read these sorts of stories, and if anyone has read any Charles Dickens books, we all know the life of a poor child in the Victorian era was fraught with cruelty and danger. But his death, though tragic, was not unusual, but is not the end of his story. The inquest into his death made the national press, and when the Earl of Shaftesbury read about his death in the London papers, he vowed to make a change. The death of George Brewster in a chimney flue in Fulbourn Hospital in 1875 was the catalyst for a change in the law criminalising the practice of using child labour in the chimney sweeping industry. This is a table of legislation. It had been brewing for some time, with many attempts over the years to make a change. Always criticised, of course, by industrialists who needed the cheap labour. But this boy was the last straw. The Earl of Shaftesbury pushed through legislation outlawing the use of climbing boys and chaired the Climbing Boys Society. His advocacy led to the passage of several pieces of legislation. Note, the previous unenforceable Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834, you can see there, second one down, stated that no child under the age of 14 could be used to clean a chimney. Now let's remember that age for later on in the story. Lord Shaftesbury was particularly troubled, despite the earlier legal changes, that the practice had just continued. The death of children, particularly a child called Christopher Drummond, 7-year-old boy from Washington, Tyne and Wear in 1872, and then, of course, George Brewster in 1875. Shaftesbury spoke in Parliament about George Brewster. Look, his name is there. And using his name to personalise the cruelty and danger of the exploitation of children, sharing these stories of terror and suffering to finally criminalise the practice after George's death in 1875. This is literally a couple of weeks after he died. George Brewster was the last child to die in England from such a practice, but his death was part of a much greater transformation of British industrial society that saw the end of child labour practices in all industries. See these dates here. There's no coincidence that these dates are so close together. It was the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 that set in motion this transformation in child labour laws and ended the use of children working in all trades in England, and leading to the provision of compulsory education for all children. Well, if the children weren't working, then they needed them off the streets. George Brewster's story, I hope you will agree, is of huge historical significance. Yet it is nowhere. Very little on the internet, nothing on Wikipedia, sadly nothing, locally on Cambridge websites. I mean, I happened to be telling an American friend who was visiting at the time, and thankfully he was no ordinary friend, and he happened to be the head of British history at the University of Alabama. And he had some time to kill, so spent a day at the British Archives in London for me. And I will be forever grateful, because with his research, we found the nuts and bolts of this story and enough research to put together for an application for a blue plaque. Jeff, my friend, found many documents for me that confirmed that that quiz question had revealed so many months before. And this paragraph from the Cambridge Independent in March the 27th, 1875, gave me so many clues. Check this out. It says, I'll read it for you in case you can't read it from the image. It says, Barnard Brewster. Note that, by the way, note that spelling. Barnard, Barnard Brewster, said, the deceased was my brother. He would be 12 next May. My father's name is John Brewster. He lived at Shadwell in London, and when the deceased was born. My mother's name was Rebecca. My brother's name is William, and his wife is Mary Ann, formerly King. And they promised to take the child and bring him up as their own. My brother was a sawyer. He had no children of his own. I saw the body of the deceased, and I saw some skin had rubbed off his hands, ears, and face. I asked Wire how it was so, and he said it had rotted off. I said it could not have done so in 8 days. Surely he could have given a better answer. He gave no answer, but made use of a coarse expression. Don't you just love the English language? This article gave me so many clues to begin my search for George's story. So, what about George? What's his story? So my next point of call was to visit the Cambridge Archives, which back then was in Shire Hall, and this is Shire Hall. Funnily enough, I mean, George lived opposite Shire Hall, so how fun is that? So this is slide 19, Shire Hall, which held the original archive from the Fulbourn Lunatic Asylum. This was quite a moment for me. I had been immersed in the legislation and looking at flat documents on a screen. I hadn't witnessed the real person until I visited Shire Hall in Cambridge that day. This is the medical superintendent's report from 1870 to December 1875. And the lovely people at the Cambridge Archives showed me this book. I leafed through the ancient pages with scrawling handwriting from December 1874, January 1875, and then into February. It jumped out at me from the page. There it was in black and white. It said, on the 11th, a boy named George Brewster, employed by William Wire, a chimney sweep, who was engaged in cleaning the boiler flues, got suffocated in the flue and died in an hour's time. An inquest was held here the next day, and a verdict of manslaughter returned upon the sweep Wire, dispatch being forwarded over to the coroner to prosecute. There it was, history in my hands, no emotion in the words. A boy had just died, it was just the facts. But it was all I needed to make it feel so very real for me. It was quite a moment for me touching those pages written just a day after the incident. As I was leaving the archives, one of the staff told me that there was a CD-ROM with a list of deaths in Cambridge and burials from that time. I had some spare time, so I took a look. I looked at the computer, and in date order, there was a George Brewster buried at St Paul's Parish in Cambridge who had died in 1875. but that was all the information it gave me. It may not have been the same George Brewster. It gave no age or date. This is St Paul's Church. And on the way back from the archive, I passed by St Paul's Church on Hills Road in Cambridge, and I went to go and look at their graveyard. Turns out St Paul's Church doesn't have a graveyard, but I was told by someone at the church that St Paul's had a parish plot in Mill Road Cemetery. I checked out the Friends of Mill Road Cemetery website, a fabulous resource that you can use to search the website for graves, but I hit a brick wall. There was no mention of George Brewster on the search function. So I penned an email. The lovely Mary and Caro got back to me, and after a bit of research, to my delight, they did have a mention of George Brewster in the St Paul's part of the cemetery from 1875. I decided that this was enough information for me to take a chance and order the death certificate for this George Brewster to see that if he was the same George Brewster. It was a long 2-week wait, and a painful £24 later, the certificate came in the post. And this was another huge moment for me. Here I have the certificate. Well, sorry, I have the certificate with me right now. And it's so full of information that helped me further with this story. It says in the box where he died on the 11th of February. When and where he died, 11th of February 1875, Lunatic Asylum, Fulbourn. You'll see that's in the second box along. And then I knew that this was the George, and he was definitely buried in the St Paul's Parish plot at Mill Road Cemetery. So I filled in the news to my new friends Mary and Caro at the Friends of Mill Road Cemetery, who agreed to come with me to show me his final resting place. Mary is a fantastic historian. With the help of others in the group and the archived church documents, Mary had documented much of the Mill Road Cemetery. And lucky for me, she did know where George Brewster was buried. The problem was the estimated spot was in the middle of a huge bush of brambles and ivy. It took, you'll remember, Caro and Mary, it took us 2 separate Mondays cutting back some of the brambles, and after unveiling many other graves in its way, we did come across the headstone of Eliza and Thomas Atkins. Mary checked with her records, and she is confident that this was the spot where George Brewster was buried 149 years ago. Since then, the grave has been reopened and used again and again with other burials. And George was the first occupant, I believe, I'm sure you'll put me straight if I'm wrong, that he was the first of 8 occupants in this plot. And Eliza Atkins being the very last, and her family were rich enough to give her a monument. And of course, the monument doesn't mention George by name, but it seems to fit the records that tells us that we know where he was buried. The area where he was buried is totally overgrown with brambles, but thanks to the work of volunteers, and I'm so happy to hear that's been cleared again, that the whole area was cleared. And that Monday in early November 2019, you'll remember, Mary and Caro, we laid some flowers, didn't we? So what now? So with my research, I approached the charity Cambridge Past, Present, Future, who run the Cambridge and District Blue Plaque Scheme. And I waited for a response after their meeting in October 2019, and we were given the go-ahead for a blue plaque for George Brewster. I then approached the building management company for the, what was the lunatic asylum. And originally, I thought this would be a simple process, but it turned out that the hierarchy of ownership went through companies to the actual owners. And I heard back from them that they would agree to a plaque on the building grounds, but they weren't keen for it to be on the building itself. And this would have been probably because, they were trying to sell office space, and, having It, reminded to people that it was an old lunatic asylum and that a boy had died there back in 1875, probably didn't sell offices for them. So while I was waiting for a response from the building company, I decided to approach the current Earl of Shaftesbury. Now, you'll remember him. He was the one that changed the law back in 1875. And I approached the current Earl of Shaftesbury, who is the great, 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 great grandson of the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury, who lives in Dorset. And he was the lord who was instrumental to the story. And he pushed for the changes in the law. And I asked the current Lord Shaftesbury if he would come up to Cambridge to unveil the plaque. He replied within a day, stating that he was very proud of his ancestors' part in the story and would be so happy to come up to the event and unveil the plaque. And on another note, he is like the cousin to the current king, so maybe he could bring his family with him. So my next job is to continue to get the story out there. Being here is all part of that, and it's getting George's story and his legacy known for all. Things are really looking up, and people are noticing George's story. I already know of two children's books that are based in some part by George's story. So it's really looking really positive to get George's story out there. His short life didn't afford him much happiness, but I've got big plans for George. And of course, I'm fundraising for the blue plaque, and plans are afoot to get maybe a marker on his grave. I want to raise awareness of this project, and we've written a press release which is kind of ready to go as soon as the current owners are happy for the plaque to go on, because the owners, when I wrote this talk, sold the building in Christmas, not the Christmas just gone, but the Christmas before, 2022. And as it turns out, the new owners of the building are actually much more happy for the plaque to go on the wall of the building. We are just waiting really for them to give us the go ahead and where they'd like the plaque to go, and then we can have this unveiling. And the thing is that next year you'll probably realise that it's actually 150 years since his death. So hopefully, fingers crossed, that we can unveil the plaque next February, and that would be like the perfect time. But while we were writing this press release, we realised as well that he is probably the first child ever to have been awarded an official blue plaque. So it's a huge story of huge historical significance. So when I say I'm going to be sitting on the One Show or the breakfast sofa, I really think that's going to happen one day. So I've also been contacted, this is a funny story, I've also been contacted by the Guild of Master Chimney Sweeps, who want to give a donation and help promote it through their channels. So once the blue plaque is, the press release goes out and things like that, it's an amazing story. And let's just take a moment here. The Guild of Master Chimney Sweeps want to endorse George's story. This is such a huge, monumental moment in history. So I approached the local press, and you may have seen the article in the Cambridge Independent, but that was back in 2022. And that's funny because that was the same paper that printed George's inquest in 149 years ago. So I will be reaching out to the national press, like BBC Breakfast, like I say, and the One Show. And I'm hoping to get the story exhibited in the Museum of Cambridge. And I do talks like to yourselves and to local schools. And my plan is to approach national museums like the Museum of Childhood and the History of England. And I'd really also like to get his name in the national curriculum. So another potentially huge part of this story is that I believe this is the first, like I said, blue plaque ever awarded to a child, and definitely is the first in Cambridge and district. And I spoke to an historian at the English Heritage who isn't aware of any other children having had a blue plaque given to them. So it's an amazing story, and we just need to keep pushing to get George's story out there. So what about George's family? Are there any descendants? So this is his family tree, and up until recently, I had exhausted all of his family tree, but you'll remember Barnard, and you'll remember his name. It was so easy to find because it's quite an unusual spelling. And he had 6 children, look, you'll see here. And I'm just thinking, surely one has traceable descendants. However, 5 of the 6 were female and, of course, have changed their names if they were ever married. So it's very hard to trace. But the new 1921 census has just been issued a couple of years ago, and I have some great links that I'm going to investigate further. And hopefully we'll find some great niece or nephew of George. Wouldn't that be a fantastic addition to the list of quotes for the press release? So I hope my passion in this story is enough to convince you of the significance of this insignificant 11-year-old boy who died not knowing that he changed the lives of so many. And if you believe, like me, that this story needs to be out there, do think of going on my Facebook page and and making a donation to the Just Giving Fund. And this will go towards not only the blue plaque, but other ways to keep his story alive. Like I'm thinking erecting some kind of headstone on his grave. And also I'd love to see a statue in Cambridge to remember all those unnamed children who suffered abuse or worse at the hands of the industrialists of the Victorian era. And we don't know their names or their stories, but we do know George, and we know his story. Let his story talk for all of those children. Thank you for listening, and if there are any questions, please do shout them out. And I'm happy to talk to anybody about George. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. That was
You're
brilliant.
welcome.
Everybody can give a clap if you're unmuted now, but I'm going to read out some questions.
Thank you,
Okay.
Joanna.
So the first question was from Nikki. Actually, they've all just changed places in front of my eyes. Whether William Wire was prosecuted.
Oh, I can't hear. Could you speak up, Mary?
Sorry. Was William Wire prosecuted?
Yes, he was prosecuted, and he got 6 months hard labour. And he was the first person to be put in prison for that crime, because it became a crime after this incident happened. So it was off the back of the fact that it became enforceable. After George's death, it became enforceable. So William Wire was the first to be put in prison. So you won't see any other chimney sweeps or anybody else that was cruel to children in prison in quite the same way before that date.
Thank you. And I think there are some details on the Mill Road Cemetery website about that as well, and the earlier part of George's life and what happened to his parents, etc.
Yeah.
The comedian Joe Lycett, this is from
Yeah.
Caro, found out in Who Do You Think You Are that he had an ancestor who was known to have worked as a chimney boy in Wimpole Hall.
That's right. I saw it. I nearly fell off my chair when I saw that episode. Basically, his great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather not only was an apprentice chimney sweep, but he also died in a lunatic asylum. The same guy. Do you know what? I did reach out to him, and I sent him an email to his agent and told him about the campaign. But I didn't hear back from him. But maybe it's time to revisit that and write to him again. Now that we're a bit closer to the blue plaque, I think it's time to start sort of reaching out again. That might be something on the list. But yeah, I do remember seeing that. I did fall off my chair.
That's always a good way of getting money if you get somebody famous. Caro also wanted to know what needed for. I think you answered that, but given the fact that he is buried where there's a lot of growth that keeps springing up all the time, it's been cleared 3 times now. Maybe we could just employ somebody to keep that area clean.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like once the story goes stratospheric, which I think it will do next year when the blue plaque is erected, you will get more visitors to his grave. And there was talk a while ago about having some kind of marker on his grave, so I think we might need to talk about that again.
I mean, that is a problem, because of course the exactness of the grave is not known, but I think there is a space nearby, and some sort of little post with something on it.
People would love to visit that, wouldn't they? I'm sure.
But you know, that may be something we could discuss with the parishes committee.
Yeah.
Someone could get a school something, I can't read that now, put on the children's opera The Little Sweep by Benjamin Britten.
Oh yes, what a good idea.
Yeah.
Yes, I had heard of that. That there is I've heard of that. What was the question, sorry?
Well, somebody was saying that it would be quite a good idea to get a local school to perform that opera.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'll come along, watch that. I'd love it. I mean, like I was saying, there's I've heard just this last couple of weeks of the 2 books that are using part of George's story as part of the the story of their books, and they're children's books. So hopefully this will, having his name highlighted and his story highlighted in these children's books might really sort of show the tell the world his story. That's all I want, really. That's the best thing that I can imagine.
And to that, in Nikki has your fundraising page. She's put that in the chat box.
Oh, so thank you. Yeah. It's just George Brewster. If you type George Brewster into the Just Giving, it will come up. And also my Facebook page has got quite a all the information, a lot of the information I've spoken about tonight about finding him and finding the story and meeting Mary and Caro, and it's been quite a journey, but we're not finished yet.
No, and I would like to point out that this whole thing has taken so much longer because, of course, COVID happened just as you were up and running and getting everything organized, and it just blew it all out the water for such a long time.
It really did. Like the company that owned the building back then, before COVID, were quite lukewarm about it, and they were quite happy to compromise with us about having the blue plaque on the wall. And then once COVID happened, of course, we're talking sort of 2 years later, they weren't so keen, and that you can kind of see it from their point of view. Trying to sell offices is not not the most attractive story to people buying office space, but the new company are so supportive, and they are all we're waiting for now is for them to say where they'd like to put it, and we're ready to go. So really happy this new company has bought the building.
And the last thing I have here is Nikki's also just put up, thank you Nikki, the Mill Road Cemetery link, and we've had a couple of thank yous on the questions as well, saying it was great talk. So
I just wanted to add, I think I missed something from I don't know if I've still got I can change. Oh, let me just go back. If you see, this is his death certificate. If you see, it says there 14 years old, and he wasn't. He was 11, and we know that from the article in the Cambridge Independent from his brother Barnard, who knew him obviously much better than anybody, knew exactly when he was born, and stated it in that article. But yet they put 14 years on his death certificate, and the reason for that was the let me just hit here we go. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1834 said that you could not use a child to clean under the age of 14. So that was my thinking, why they lied about his age, so that the sweep wouldn't go to prison, because he had kind of like stayed in the law, as it were, from that law in 1834. But it's very interesting that somebody lied and they put it on his death certificate. It's very sad, isn't it?
Yeah. But not unheard of in those days. Well, even now.
Joanne, could you read what it says under cause of death for that? I can read manslaughter by William Wire.
Yes, with pleasure. Manslaughter by William Wire, a chimney sweep. And then it says allowing him
Is
to
it incredibly allowing?
I got allowing him to enter a flue for the pursuit.
Knowingly allowing him.
That's it. Knowingly to allow him to enter a flue for the purpose of cleaning it, where he was suffocated. I mean, it's amazing. You never see death. I've seen a few death certificates that, a little bit of research I've done in the time. You get very little information in these sorts of things, but somebody wanted us to know about what happened there. Somebody filled this in very well. And it's interesting as well that they had the inquest the next day. I mean, nowadays these sorts of things take months to do, but literally he seemed to have stayed at the lunatic asylum overnight to the next day, where they had the inquest, which is really, really poignant, because when I worked in the building, there's a chapel inside the building, still there now. They obviously use it for a conference centre. It's got like conference tables in and everything, but you can tell it's a chapel. It's got, stained glass windows. It's got sort of plaques on the wall for people that had passed away. You can tell it used to be a chapel. And I just wonder if maybe they lied him in, they lay him in there overnight. And whenever I went in there, and this was before I even knew about his story, I'd go into meetings in that room and it would feel very cold and very eerie. But, it was that kind of building. So
we've just had a message.
Oh, I can't hear you, Mary.
Sorry?
Can't hear you, Mary.
Oh, speak up, Mary.
I can't see.
Oh.
You, darling.
Can you see the question, Caro?
Just a second. I
can see it. It says
the chimney climbers. Oh, Nikki, you do it.
The chimney climbers used to climb naked, as clothes increased the risk of getting trapped. Health and safety ? This increased exposure to toxic chemicals. There was chimney sweeps cancer that affected them in later life, and that's from Paul Sanders. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I heard that as well. And in fact, that Joe Lycett, Who Do You Think You Are, did talk about that cancer that they often chimney sweeps got, but it was sort of adult chimney sweeps would often get prostate cancer. And they it wasn't obviously was not a love, a nice job to have, and even worse if you were a child. And it actually says in the in some of the research that I found, that there was a bit more description of what William Wire had said to George as he sort of, sent him up the chimney. And it said that he put his hat over his face to sort of, cover his face so that he would not breathing so much soot. So it made me think that, hopefully there was some, care given to him, and it was just a tragic accident. But we know the history, don't we? We know how children were looked after back in those days.
Debbie has just put in that
we can't hear you, darling.
Yeah, could somebody read it, Caro?
We can't hear you.
Can you look at the question?
Debbie has said she worked in the Fulbourn building until 2019, had been into the chapel.
Yeah.
And thank you for a talk. And I know I tried to contact the previous, as you said, Joanne, the previous people, and I'll be in touch with you, because it's possible that Frederick Leach worked in that chapel, and I was trying to get access but never succeeded. So perhaps I'll be in touch with you. But Debbie says it's a lovely talk, very insightful. And Vicky Weil says, thank you very much. All good wishes with your campaign. I think Heather had asked a question about previously about, does anyone know how many blue plaques are awarded this year? I do know that if you go on to Cambridge, past, present and future, there is a list of the blue plaques that they've installed. I don't know about nationally, but there is on the Cambridge past, present and future list of the Cambridge plaques. And Heather also says the informant on the death certificate was the coroner. So perhaps he wanted the manner of the boy's death not to be forgotten.
Very good point. And, you know, I'm very grateful to whoever wrote the death certificate, that they put in such a lot of information there. It's really crucial. Talking about what was it that Heather mentioned before?
Blue plaques. How many? She'd asked, does anyone know how many blue plaques are awarded each year?
Well, so so London blue plaque, so you see them a lot when you walk around the streets in London, don't you? And that's done by English Heritage. English Heritage run the London blue plaque scheme. Now, outside of London, it's run by so for instance, Cambridge and South Cambridgeshire blue plaque scheme is run by Cambridge Past, Present, Future, and other counties and districts around the country, you know, in Scotland, all sorts, they've got their own blue plaque schemes. So it's very difficult for me to find out for absolute 100% sure that he was the only official, because you know, you can buy a blue plaque on eBay, but the official blue plaque for a child, because if you think about it, why would a child get a blue plaque? Because a blue plaque is given to someone who has done something amazing, or, you know, extraordinary in their life. And really, how many children could really like say that would happen at, you know, such a young age before they even hit 18? So I'm very confident that I believe that he is the only child to have ever officially been granted a blue plaque. And that is a huge story in itself. And so in our press release, we're putting something along the lines of, you know, it's believed to be the only plaque for a child, but there's not really a way that we can you know, check that 100%, because you'd have to reach out to all of these small little schemes that are all over the country to double check. You know, I could FOI every single county council and scheme, but you know, it would just take such a long time. And I've done some due diligence already. I mean, there's a Wikipedia page about blue plaques, and somebody's done a lot of research about blue plaques. You should check it out. Obviously, this guy knows his stuff about blue plaques, and there's not one mention for a child on there. Also, I asked the English Heritage, you know, the London blue plaque people, they weren't aware that there was ever a blue plaque for a child. And so, you know, I think I've done quite a lot of research, and I think, and also I've checked obviously on Google and on other, you know, other search engines to check to see if anyone mentions anything, and there's just no mention of it. And you think, you know, the internet's been going for quite a long time now, that if there was a mention of it, it would have come up. So I'm quite confident that he's the only child to have been given a blue plaque.
I think that's all the questions now. I don't know if anybody can hear me.
You can.
Okay, so thank you very much. You've worked very hard on this, and I really hope that one day we'll be standing there and watching that blue plaque of a young
You
baby.
will. And Cara and Mary, just wanted a shout out for you guys. You know, you've been so helpful in all of this. And the funny thing is that weird things happen when I talk about George Brewster. Like, I did a talk in Linton Historical Society a few weeks ago, and as I was getting out of my car, a feather landed on my foot. And you know, and also I drove behind, on the way to the talk, I drove behind a chimney sweep van, and I never see them. And and also the lady that I did the talk, she gave me one raffle ticket, and of course people buy, like, you know, loads of raffle tickets. But do you know what? I won the raffle. You know, it's the weirdest things happen when I talk about him, and it just brings, you know, it's so interesting when I talk to people. They just get it. They get the story. They get this historical significance of his life and his legacy and what it means to children today. And the thing is, children learn about the Industrial Revolution in schools. They learn about child labour laws in schools. They even learn about chimney sweep children in schools, but they don't know about George Brewster, and they don't know that it was him that changed the laws, that was a domino effect, that means that, you know, children should be really thanking him today, that, you know, that they're in compulsory education. Probably wouldn't thank him, but, you know, they're getting free education and they're not in a mine or in a factory or up a chimney. So, you know, we all need to thank and tell our children about George Brewster.